The town feared the rancher in his old cabin, whispered he was dangerous, cursed, maybe even a killer. For years, no one dared step close to his door. But one stormy night, an abandoned dog stumbled inside, and everything began to change. The rancher fed it, healed it, and carried it into town. Suddenly, the man everyone feared wasn't standing alone anymore. He had a loyal companion by his side. And that's when the town started to wonder, had they been wrong about him all along? But just as hope flickered, a railroad agent arrived with papers to take the rancher's land. The council cheered. The whispers turned cruel again. Someone in the dark set out to destroy the one friend the rancher had left. Now, with a dying dog, a broken treaty, and a town divided, the truth is about to be tested. Can mercy and honor overcome fear and greed? Or will the past swallow the rancher whole before anyone learns who he really is? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. Samuel Boone pulled his worn leather collar tight against the bitter winter wind as he guided his horse down Cedar Gulch's main street. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, but offered little warmth. His mare's hooves clicked steadily on the hard-packed dirt, the sound echoing off the weathered storefronts. As he passed the schoolhouse, high-pitched voices fell silent. Through the window, he caught glimpses of small faces pressed against the glass, then quickly disappearing behind the curtains. Samuel kept his eyes fixed ahead, his scarred face partially hidden beneath his hat brim. He'd grown used to this reaction, though it still stung like a thorn under his skin. Get away from there. The schoolteacher's sharp voice carried through the walls. Samuel's shoulders tensed, but he maintained his steady pace. Outside the general store, Mrs. Peterson hurried her two young boys along, pulling them close to her skirts as Samuel approached. The smaller one pointed and started to speak, but his mother shushed him quickly. "Inside now, both of you," she whispered, though her words carried clearly in the still afternoon air. The bell above the store's door jangled as they rushed inside. Samuel dismounted stiffly, Hayes' boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. He looped his reins around the hitching post, giving his horse a gentle pat on her neck. "Won't be long, girl," he murmured. The mare nickered softly, the only friendly sound he'd heard all day. The store's interior was warm and dim, smelling of coffee beans and leather. Behind the counter, Mr. Jenkins was arranging tinned goods on a high shelf. He turned at the sound of Samuel's entrance, and his friendly shopkeeper's smile faltered. "Mr. Boone," Jenkins said, his voice carefully neutral. "What can I get for you today?" Samuel pulled a folded list from his pocket, smoothing it against the counter. His rough hands, marked with years of ranch work, contrasted sharply with the clean wood surface. "Just the usual supplies," he said quietly. "Coffee, flour, salt, pork. Some lamp oil, too, if you've got it." As Jenkins gathered the items, the whispers started from the back of the store. Samuel didn't need to turn around to know Mrs. Peterson was there with her friend Mrs. Collins, their heads bent close together. "Killed that man up near Beaver Creek?" The words drifted across the store, barely audible. "Cold blood, they say," came the response. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes fixed on the counter. The rumors had followed him to Cedar Gulch like faithful hounds, growing more elaborate with each retelling. He'd learned it was better not to challenge them, better to let people believe what they would. Jenkins returned with the supplies, setting each item down with careful precision. "That'll be $4.25, he said. Still not quite meeting Samuel's eyes. Samuel counted out the money, leaving it in neat stacks. "Much obliged," he said, gathering his purchases into his saddlebags. The whispers followed him to the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the first hint of snow. Samuel secured his supplies and mounted up, eager to leave town behind. As he rode past the saloon, two cowboys stepped out onto the boardwalk. The younger one started to raise his hand in greeting, but his companion grabbed his arm, shaking his head in warning. The route home took him past the cemetery where his wife Sarah and their infant son lay buried. Samuel touched the brim of his hat as he passed, a gesture he'd performed so many times it had become automatic. The markers were simple wood crosses, the names already beginning to fade despite his careful maintenance. The sight of them opened up that familiar hollow place inside him, the emptiness that no amount of work seemed to fill. His cabin sat alone on a rise above Cedar Creek. The structure weathered but solid. Smoke from the morning's fire still curled from the chimney, though it had burned low during his absence. Samuel took care of his horse first, as always. He removed her saddle and brushed her down thoroughly, making sure she had fresh hay and water before heading inside. The cabin's interior was neat but sparse. A few pieces of simple furniture, some tools hanging on the walls, and a shelf of books Sarah had loved, the only touches of softness in the utilitarian space. Samuel lit the lamp and stirred the fire back to life, then set about preparing his evening meal. The beans bubbled slowly in the iron pot, their simple aroma filling the single room. Samuel cut a thick slice of bread from yesterday's loaf and sat at the table, eating mechanically while watching shadows dance on the wall. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the scrape of his spoon against the bowl and the increasing moan of the wind outside. He'd grown used to the quiet over the past 2 years, or so he told himself. But some nights, like this one, it seemed to have weight and substance, like a heavy blanket thrown over his shoulders. The wind rattled the shutters, making the lamp flame jump and flicker. Samuel washed his dishes and put them away, each movement precise and practiced. As he prepared for bed, checking the door latch and banking the fire for the night, a new sound cut through the wind's howl. A scratching at the door, faint but distinct. Samuel froze, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace. The scratching came again, followed by a soft, pitiful whine. Samuel stood motionless, listening intently. It could be a coyote, though they rarely came so close to human dwellings. The whine sounded again, more desperate this time, he thought, of the stories that sometimes circulated about wolves, about mountain lions that grew bold when winter thinned the game. The wind gusted harder, making the whole cabin creak. The scratching continued, accompanied by what sounded almost like a sob. Samuel's hand dropped away from the rifle. Whatever was out there sounded more miserable than dangerous. Still, years of frontier living had taught him caution. He picked up the lamp and moved carefully toward the door, his boots silent on the wooden floor. Samuel's hand hesitated on the door latch. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the cabin walls, and the scratching came again, weaker now. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, then pulled the heavy door open just enough to shine the lamplight outside. There on his threshold lay a dog, its matted fur crusted with ice and snow. It was a shepherd breed, the kind meant for herding sheep, though no sheep ranchers worked this part of the territory. The animal lifted its head weakly, revealing eyes glazed with exhaustion and pain. Its ribs stood out sharp against its sides, and dark stains marked the snow where its bleeding paws had carried it to his door. Samuel's first instinct was to shove it back into the storm with his boot. He had enough troubles without taking on a half-dead stray. But as he stood there, lamp held high, the dog tried to stand. Its legs trembled with the effort and then gave out completely. It collapsed across his threshold with a soft whimper that cut through Samuel's defenses like a knife through butter. "Daggum-it," he muttered, setting the lamp on a nearby shelf. The dog was heavier than it looked, its wet fur soaking through his shirt as he lifted it. He grunted with the effort, careful not to jostle the animal too much as he carried it inside and laid it by the hearth. The fire had burned low, but still cast enough warmth to start melting the ice in the dog's coat. Samuel added fresh logs to the fire, building it back up until flames danced high and bright. The dog watched him through. Half-closed eyes, its breath coming in ragged pants. Up close, Samuel could see it was male, probably young despite his sorry condition. No collar marked his neck, though the fur there was worn as if he'd recently slipped free of one. "Someone done you wrong, didn't they?" Samuel said softly, surprising himself by speaking aloud. The dog's tail twitched slightly in response, though whether from recognition or just reflex, Samuel couldn't tell. He fetched the pot of leftover beans from his supper, still warm on the back of the stove. The dog's nose twitched at the smell, but he made no move toward the food when Samuel set it near his head. Samuel dipped his fingers in the beans and held them near the dog's mouth. After a moment's hesitation, a rough tongue licked them clean. "That's right," Samuel encouraged, his voice low and steady. "Eat what you can." It took time and patience, but eventually the dog managed to eat most of the beans. Samuel brought water next, holding a tin cup so the animal could drink without having to move. When both food and water were done, he turned his attention to the bleeding paws. The dog tensed when Samuel first touched him, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Samuel kept his movements slow and deliberate, speaking in that same quiet voice he'd used with injured horses during the war. "Easy now. Just gonna see what's what." The pads of all four paws were torn and bloody, probably from miles of running through frozen ground and ice. Samuel cleaned them carefully with warm water and a soft rag, noting how the dog gradually relaxed under his ministrations. When the wounds were clean, he wrapped them loosely in strips torn from an old shirt. Outside, the blizzard had built to full fury. Snow rattled against the windows like thrown sand, and the wind found every crack and seam in the cabin's walls. Samuel retrieved his old wool blanket from the bed, the one Sarah had made their first winter together. He hadn't used it since, her passing keeping it folded away with her other things. Now he spread it over the trembling dog, tucking it around him with careful hands. "Won't do having you freeze after all this trouble," he said gruffly, trying to ignore the way his throat had tightened at the familiar feel of Sarah's blanket. The dog's eyes followed him as he moved around the cabin, banking the fire for the night and checking the windows were secure against the storm. When Samuel finally settled into his chair by the hearth, those eyes still watched him. They reminded him of Sarah's somehow warm and knowing, seeing past his scars to something deeper. Samuel dozed fitfully in the chair, waking often to add wood to the fire and check on his patient. The dog's breathing remained labored through the night, each intake of air seeming to cause pain. Once, in the darkest hours before dawn, Samuel found himself praying, something he hadn't done since burying his wife and son. The words came rusty and uncertain. "Lord, if you're still listening to the likes of me, help this poor creature make it through the night. Seems he's had enough hardship for one lifetime." Morning light crept through the frost-covered windows, painting the cabin's interior in pale grays and golds. Samuel blinked away his exhaustion and leaned forward in his chair. The dog lay still under Sarah's blanket, and for a moment Samuel's heart clenched with familiar grief. Then he saw the slow rise and fall of breathing, steadier now than the night before. As if sensing Samuel's attention, the dog lifted his head. His eyes were clearer, more alert, and his tail moved weakly against the floorboards in a tentative wag. Something in Samuel's chest loosened at the sight, a knot of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Reckon you're staying then?" he said, his voice rough with mourning and emotion. The dog's tail thumped a little stronger, and Samuel found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He smiled. The blizzard still raged outside, but in the cabin's warmth, two lonely souls had found something neither had been looking. for a chance at companionship, and perhaps even healing. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow, turning the world into a sea of diamonds. Samuel pushed open his cabin door, breathing in the crisp air. His boots crunched through the pristine, white blanket as he headed toward the woodpile. Behind him came the soft click of nails on wood, followed by a whimper. The dog stood in the doorway, testing his bandaged paws on the cold porch boards. Samuel turned, frowning. "You stay put now. Them wrappings won't do much good in the snow." But the dog ignored him, limping down the steps with determination. Each step seemed to pain him, yet he followed Samuel's path with single-minded focus. When Samuel reached the woodpile, the dog settled nearby, watching intently as he positioned a log on the chopping block. "Suit yourself," Samuel muttered, lifting the axe. "But don't come crying to me when your feet start hurting worse." The sharp crack of splitting wood echoed across the snow-covered yard. As Samuel worked, sweat dampening his shirt despite the cold, he found himself growing oddly aware of his audience. The dog's eyes followed every movement, head tilting at each swing of the axe. When Samuel paused to catch his breath, the animal's tail would wag encouragingly. "Ain't you got something better to do?" Samuel grumbled, but there was no real irritation in his voice. Truth be told, the quiet companionship felt different. Not unwelcome, exactly, though he'd never admit it aloud by midday. Samuel had a decent pile of split wood stacked against the cabin wall. His supplies were running low. He'd need flour, coffee, and more beans if he was feeding to mouths now. The thought gave him pause. When had he started counting the dog as permanent? He saddled his horse, an elderly bay gelding named Buck, and secured his saddlebags. The dog watched from the porch, ears pricked forward with interest. As Samuel swung into the saddle, the animal struggled to his feet. "Oh, no, you don't," Samuel said firmly. "You're staying here." The dog took a tentative step forward, then another, clearly favoring his sore paws, but determined nonetheless. Samuel clicked Buck into a walk, hoping the dog would give up and return to the cabin's warmth. Instead, the shepherd fell in behind the horse, maintaining a steady, if limping, pace. Samuel reined Buck to a stop. "Listen here," he said, pointing back at the cabin. "Go home." The dog sat, regarding him with patient eyes that seemed to say he'd wait all day if needed. Samuel sighed, shoulders slumping in defeat. "Stubborn creature," he muttered, but nudged Buck forward again. The dog rose immediately, trotting behind them with what Samuel could have sworn was a satisfied air. The 3-mile ride to Cedar Gulch took longer than usual with their injured companion, but the dog never fell behind. When they reached the edge of town, Samuel noticed heads turning, voices dropping to whispers. Nothing new there, except this time the whispers held a different note. Curiosity rather than fear. Samuel dismounted outside the mercantile, tying Buck to the hitching post. The dog settled beside the horse, panting slightly from exertion, but alert. After a moment's hesitation, Samuel tied the dog's makeshift lead rope to the post as well. "Stay," he ordered, though he reckoned it was unnecessary. The animal hadn't strayed more than 10 feet from him all morning. Inside the store, Samuel kept his usual routine, head down, minimal words, gathering only what he needed. But through the window, he could see a gathering crowd around his unexpected companion. 2 small children, the Cooper twins, crept closer to the dog. Their mother stood nearby, watching with cautious interest rather than her usual fear. The dog's tail wagged gently as the children approached, his entire demeanor softening. Little Mary Cooper reached out a tentative hand, giggling when the shepherd licked her fingers. The sound drew Samuel's attention. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard children laughing near him. The peaceful scene shattered when 3 older boys from the Miller family rounded the corner. They'd always been troublemakers, and today proved no different. The first rock they threw missed, but the second struck the dog's flank. The shepherd surged to his feet, lips pulling back to reveal sharp teeth. His bark was deep and threatening, sending the boys scrambling backward. "Serves." "Them right?" came a woman's voice. Samuel turned to find Martha Wilson, the blacksmith's widow, standing beside him. She smiled, actually smiled at him. "Those boys have needed a good scare for months. They've been terrorizing everyone's chickens." Samuel struggled to find words, unused to casual conversation. "Dogs just protecting himself," he managed finally. "And doing a fine job of it," Martha replied. Her smile softened something in her face, reminding Samuel that she'd once been considered the prettiest girl in 3 counties. "It's good to see you with a companion, Mr. Boone. That old place of yours must get lonely." Before Samuel could respond, she'd moved away to examine a shelf of preserves, leaving him standing there with an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. The ride home was quieter. The dog clearly tired, but still keeping pace. Samuel found himself checking over his shoulder more, often than necessary, making sure the animal wasn't struggling too much. When they reached the cabin, the dog flopped down by the hearth with a contented sigh, while Samuel put away his supplies. The familiar routine of making supper felt different somehow. Samuel added extra meat to his usual stew, watching from the corner of his eye as the dog's nose twitched at the smell. When the food was ready, he filled 2 bowls, one for himself, one for his new companion. The dog's enthusiasm for the meal was obvious. He attacked the stew with gusto, licking the bowl clean before looking hopefully at Samuel for more. The expression was so earnest, so transparently hopeful, that something strange happened in Samuel's chest. A rusty sound emerged from his throat, surprising them both laughter. It wasn't much of a laugh, more of a chuckle really, but it was the first one to echo off these cabin walls in years. The dog's tail thumped against the floor in response, and Samuel found himself smiling again as he scraped the last bits from the pot into the animal's bowl. They settled in for the evening, Samuel in his chair, the dog sprawled nearby. The fire crackled warmly, its light dancing across the walls. The silence that filled the cabin was different now, less like a weight and more like a blanket, comfortable and shared. Samuel pulled out his pipe, packed it with tobacco, and lit it carefully. As he puffed, sending lazy smoke rings toward the ceiling, he realized something had shifted today. The cabin no longer felt quite so empty. The endless quiet no longer pressed quite so hard. And if his hand occasionally dropped to scratch behind the dog's ears, well, there was no one around to comment on it. Dawn broke cold and clear over Cedar Gulch. Samuel stood on his cabin porch, steaming coffee cup in hand, watching the shepherd dog explore the frosted yard. The animal moved easier now, his paws healing well enough to leave clear tracks in the morning frost. "Best get to work," Samuel muttered, draining the last of his coffee. The fence line needed mending. Several posts had rotted through during the wet autumn months. He gathered his tools, hammer, saw, and the few spare boards he'd managed to salvage from an old barn. The dog followed at his heels as Samuel trudged through the crusty snow to the sagging fence. Without being asked, the animal settled nearby, alert eyes scanning the tree line while Samuel worked. The quiet companionship felt natural now, like the rhythm of hammer striking nails or the creak of wood under his hands. "Hold this steady," Samuel found himself saying as he positioned a board. The dog's tail wagged at being addressed, though he made no move to actually help. Samuel shook his head, wondering when he'd started talking to animals like they were people by midday. The winter sun had barely taken the edge off the cold. Samuel's back ached from wrestling with stubborn posts, and his water bucket was running low. He whistled softly, catching the dog's attention. "Come on then, time to haul water." The creek gurgled beneath a thin sheet of ice, winter clear and sharp. Samuel broke through the surface with his bucket while the dog lapped carefully at the edge. The animal's presence made the chore feel less solitary somehow. Samuel had spent 3 years hauling water alone, the silence broken only by the creeks. Song. Now he had a witness to his daily rituals, someone who waited patiently as he filled the bucket and seemed to understand the importance of steady hands on the walk back. After storing the water, Samuel checked his supplies. He was running low on nails and salt, essential items he couldn't do without. "Looks like another trip to town," he told the dog, who perked up immediately at the prospect. They rode into Cedar Gulch in the quiet of mid-afternoon, when most folks were busy with their own work. But today was different. A crowd had gathered outside the Mercantile, their voices carrying an unusual excitement. At the center stood a stranger, tall, well-dressed in an Eastern-cut suit that looked out of place among the townspeople's worn clothes. Samuel dismounted carefully, tying Buck and the dog to their usual spot. The shepherd's ears were pricked forward, sensing the change in atmosphere. Samuel gave him a reassuring pat before heading into the store, trying to ignore the way conversations died as he passed. Inside, he could still hear fragments of talk through the window. The stranger's voice carried clearly educated, confident, full of promises. "The railroad means progress, my friends. Jobs for your sons, markets for your goods." Cedar Gulch could become a real city. Old Tom behind the counter barely looked up as Samuel gathered his supplies. "Reckon you heard about the railroad man," he said finally, measuring out salt. Samuel grunted non-committally. "Mr. Caldwell, he calls himself. Got papers from back east. Says the line's coming through by spring." Tom paused, weighing his words. "Says it'll run right along the creek." Samuel's hands stilled on the counter. His cabin sat above that creek, on land his father had settled 30 years ago. Land he'd fought to keep during the war. Land that still held his wife's flowers in the garden. "There's to be a council meeting tonight," Tom added quietly. "Might want to attend, seeing as how it concerns your property and all." Samuel paid for his supplies in silence, mind churning. Outside, the crowd had grown. Caldwell stood on the Mercantile steps now, holding official-looking documents that caught the afternoon sun. His smile was practiced, perfect, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "The future is coming to Cedar Gulch," Caldwell announced, his voice carrying across the street. "All we need is the cooperation of a few holdouts. Progress cannot be stopped by 1 or 2 stubborn individuals." His gaze flickered to Samuel, brief but meaningful. The townsfolk turned to stare, their expressions a mix of pity and determination. Samuel recognized the look he'd seen it before, when people had already made up their minds about him. The council meeting that evening was held in the church, the only building large enough to hold the whole town. Samuel sat in the back, the dog loyal at his feet despite disapproving glances from the deacon. Caldwell commanded the room from the pulpit, his voice smooth as honey as he laid out his vision. "The railroad will bring prosperity to all," he promised, spreading maps across the lectern. "New businesses, new opportunities. Your children won't have to leave home to find their fortunes." Samuel watched faces light up with hope and greed. Mothers whispered about proper stores with ready-made clothes. Farmers calculated faster routes to market. Even the preacher nodded along, clearly seeing larger congregations in his future. "Of course," Caldwell continued, his tone carefully modulated, "some sacrifices will be necessary. The line must follow the creek engineering requirements, you understand? A few properties will need to be relocated." The room grew quiet. Everyone knew whose land lay along the creek. "Fair compensation will be offered," Caldwell assured them, but his eyes were cold when they met Samuel's. "Those who cooperate will find the railroad company most generous. Those who don't—" He let the threat hang unspoken. The meeting dissolved into eager discussion of progress and possibilities. Samuel slipped out unnoticed, the dog close behind. The night air felt clean after the stuffy church, but it couldn't wash away the bitter taste in his mouth. Back at his cabin, Samuel lit the lamp with shaking hands. The dog watched as he pulled out his father's old strongbox, removing carefully preserved deeds and documents. The paper felt fragile under his fingers, yellowed records of purchase. Boundaries marked in fading ink, his father's bold signature at the bottom. Samuel spread them across the rough table, though he knew every word by heart. His fists clenched until his knuckles showed white. The dog whined softly, pressing against his leg. After a moment, the animal laid its head in Samuel's lap, warm and solid and real. The simple comfort broke something loose in Samuel's chest. They'd rather see me gone than stand up for the truth, he whispered into the quiet room. The dog's eyes met his, steady and understanding. Here was one creature, at least, who wouldn't be swayed by pretty promises and paper dreams. Samuel's hand found the dog's ears, scratching gently. The familiar motion helped calm the trembling in his fingers, though the anger still burned deep in his gut. Outside, an owl called across the creek, his land, his home. The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor. A quiet reminder that he wasn't facing this fight alone. The lamp burned low as Samuel sat there, documents untouched before him, the dog a warm weight against his legs. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, the silence wrapped around them like a shield against the world's demands. The winter days stretched long and cold across Cedar Gulch. Samuel kept to his routine, chopping wood, mending fences, tending to the basic needs that filled a solitary life. But something had shifted, subtle as snowmelt. The dog's presence drew unexpected visitors to his cabin porch, their feet crunching on frozen ground where before there had been only silence. It started with the Miller children, 3 small figures hovering at his gate one morning. They stood watching the shepherd dog chase snowflakes, their breath making clouds in the crisp air. Samuel caught himself pausing in his work, axe suspended mid-swing. He won't bite. He found himself saying the words rough from disuse. The children edged closer, and the dog trotted over, tail wagging. Soon their laughter rang across the yard as they tossed sticks for the eager animal. Mrs. Wilson, a widow from town, brought soup the next day. "For looking after my Tommy," she explained, nodding toward the dog. "He was in that group yesterday. First time I've seen the boy smile since his father passed." Samuel accepted the pot awkwardly, unused to gifts. The dog pressed against his leg, steady as always. "Much obliged," he managed. She lingered, asking about the vegetable patch he'd cleared. Before he knew it, Samuel was describing how his wife, Sarah, had planned it years ago, placing stones to mark the rows. The memory spilled out like water from a cracked jug, Sarah's hands patting soil, her smile bright as morning glory blooms. The dog sat between them, head cocked as if listening. Mrs. Wilson's eyes softened with understanding. She had a good eye for growing things, she said gently. Samuel nodded, throat tight. After she left, he stood a long while by the empty garden, the dog quiet beside him. More visitors came as the weeks passed. Children brought scraps for the dog, staying to hear tales of the places Samuel had seen during the war, though he was careful to leave out the darker parts. He found himself speaking of comrades who'd shared his campfire, of the night sky over Virginia fields, of a horse that had carried him through 3 battles. Before taking a bullet meant for him, the dog would rest its head on his knee as he talked, as if encouraging the words to flow. Sometimes Samuel wondered if the animal understood more than it let on, the way it seemed to know when memories weighed too heavy. In town, the changes were slower but steady. Samuel noticed fewer doors closing as he passed, more nods of greeting. The dog's reputation had grown. The hero dog, children called it, after it chased off Watson's mean rooster and helped find little Jenny Parker when she wandered off. It was after Sunday service in late January when Kimberly Hart, the schoolteacher, approached him. Samuel had taken to waiting outside with the dog while the congregation filed out, avoiding the press of people and their hymns that stirred memories best left buried. "Mr. Boone," she said, holding out a covered dish, "I brought you something." The dog's tail thumped against Samuel's boot. Kimberly smiled down at it, then met Samuel's surprised gaze. "Apple pie," she explained, "to thank you and your friend here for watching over my pupils. They tell me he escorts them past Miller's Bowl every morning." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't nothing special. Dog just does what comes natural. Sometimes the simplest kindnesses mean the most." Her voice was gentle but firm, like she used with her students. "The children feel safer knowing you're both there." The dog leaned against her skirts, and she scratched its ears. Samuel found himself noticing how the winter sun caught gold lights in her brown hair, how steady her eyes were when she spoke. "We've missed you in church," she continued. "The second pew on the right has been empty too long." Samuel stiffened. That had been his family's pew, where Sarah had sat straight and proud, her voice clear on every hymn. "Got chores," he said shortly. "God doesn't stop caring for us just because we turn away," Kimberly said softly. "Your neighbors haven't either, though you might think so." Before he could respond, she pressed the pie into his hands. "I'll bring the dish by later, if that's all right." The dog whined, hopefully, making her laugh. Samuel found himself nodding, though alarm bells rang in his mind. True to her word, Kimberly appeared at his cabin that evening, just as the sun was setting. Samuel had spent the afternoon in an unfamiliar state of anticipation, straightening things he'd never bothered with before. The dog watched his nervous pacing with what seemed like amusement. "Evening, Mr. Boone," she called from the gate. "May I come in?" Samuel opened the door wider, acutely aware of the cabin's sparse furnishings. But Kimberly settled into his one extra chair as naturally as if she visited every day, the dog curling at her feet. "That was fine pie," Samuel offered gruffly. "My mother's recipe." She smiled. She always said food opens doors better than words. Reckon she was right about that. "The church doors are open too," she said after a moment. "Pastor Matthews asked about you just yesterday." Samuel moved to the stove, busying himself with the coffee pot. "Been a while since I felt welcome there." "Things change, Mr. Boone. People, too." She watched him pour 2 cups. "The children's stories about you and this good dog, they've reminded folks of who you used to be. Who you still are, under all that silence." Her words stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. "Been too long," he muttered. "Wouldn't know what to do with myself anymore." "You'd find your way back," Kimberly said simply. "Faith is like that. Patient, waiting. Like this fellow here." She patted the dog's head. "Sometimes it just takes one small step to start the journey home." They sat in companionable quiet, sipping coffee as darkness gathered outside. When Kimberly finally rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Think about it, won't you? Next Sunday." After she'd gone, Samuel broke his last piece of cornbread in half, sharing it with the dog. The animal took its portion delicately, tail wagging at the treat. "World's changing on me," Samuel sighed, running a hand over the dog's fur. The shepherd pressed closer, offering its steady comfort. Together, they watched the stars emerge, bright as hope in the winter sky. Samuel sat long into the evening, thinking about faith and second chances, about how a stray dog had somehow started leading him back toward the light. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in years, he felt something like peace settling in his bones. Sunday dawned clear and cold. The kind of morning that turned breath to frost and made bootsteps crunch on frozen ground. Samuel stood before his cracked mirror, fumbling with a tie he hadn't worn in years. His fingers felt thick and clumsy with the unfamiliar motion. The dog watched from its place by the hearth, head tilted in curiosity at its master's strange behavior. Samuel had brushed his coat until the worn fabric almost shone and even trimmed. His beard, though his hands had shaken doing it. "Don't know what I'm thinking," he muttered, giving up on the tie. The dog's tail thumped against the floorboards. "Whole town'll likely clear out when I walk in." But he'd promised Kimberly, and something in him couldn't bear to disappoint her. The memory of her steady gaze, her gentle invitation, had haunted him all week. The walk to town felt longer than usual. Samuel's boots left solitary tracks in the fresh snow, the dog following close behind. The church bell tolled across Cedar Gulch, calling the faithful to worship. With each step, Samuel's chest grew tighter. Kimberly waited at the church steps, her face brightening when she spotted him. She wore a blue dress that matched the winter sky, her hair swept up neat beneath her bonnet. "Mr. Boone," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you came." The dog wagged its tail in greeting, and Kimberly bent to scratch its ears. "And you too, faithful friend." Samuel cleared his throat. "Ain't sure about bringing him in. Nonsense. He's better behaved than half the children." She smiled, taking Samuel's arm as naturally as breathing. "Shall we?" The church door creaked open, and Samuel hesitated at the threshold. But Kimberly's hand was warm on his sleeve, and the dog pressed against his leg, urging him forward. Inside, the familiar scent of beeswax candles and pine wood wrapped around him. Conversations died mid-sentence as heads turned. Samuel felt the weight of every stare, heard the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Thompson in the front pew. The silence was absolute, broken only by the click of the dog's nails on the wooden floor. Someone's hymnal dropped with a thud. A child whispered, "Mama, look, it's the hero dog." Kimberly guided Samuel to the second pew on the right, his old family spot. The dog settled beneath a bench, laying its head on its paws. Samuel sat stiffly, aware of the empty space beside him where Sarah used to be. Behind them, whispers rustled like dry leaves, bold as brass, bringing that animal never thought to see him here again. That schoolteacher's got nerve, but... Then Pastor Matthews stepped to the pulpit, his deep voice filling the church. "Welcome, brothers and sisters. We gather today to praise the Lord and remember His infinite mercy." The familiar words washed over Samuel. His hands clenched in his lap until Kimberly quietly passed him her hymnal, open to amazing grace. When the organ began, her voice rose clear and strong beside him. Samuel couldn't bring himself to sing. But the music stirred something deep inside. Memories of Sarah harmonizing beside him, of his daughter learning the words in her clear child's voice. The dog shifted at his feet, and Samuel felt tears burning behind his eyes. The sermon passed. In a blur, Pastor Matthews spoke of prodigal sons and welcome tables, of doors thrown wide and hearts made new. Samuel kept his gaze fixed forward, though he felt the weight of the congregation's attention. When service ended, Samuel stayed seated as others filed out, not ready to face the press of people. But the dog had other ideas. It stood, tail wagging, and nosed at his hand. "He knows where the children will be," Kimberly said softly. "They always gather to play while their parents talk." Sure enough, excited young voices drifted through the open door. Samuel squared his shoulders and stood. "Reckon we shouldn't disappoint them." Outside, the winter sun had warmed the air. Children crowded around as soon as they spotted the dog, their earlier wariness of Samuel forgotten in their excitement. "Can we pet him, Mr. Boone?" little Jenny Parker asked, her eyes bright with hope. Samuel nodded, watching as small hands reached out to stroke the dog's fur. The animal soaked up the attention, tail sweeping the ground. "He saved my little sister." Tommy Wilson announced proudly. "Mama says he's an angel in dog form." "Now, Tommy," his mother called, approaching with careful steps. "Don't pester Mr. Boone." But she smiled, and Samuel found himself attempting a smile in return. More parents drifted over, drawn by their children's laughter. The awkward silence of previous encounters gave way to cautious questions about the dog. Then tentative comments about the weather and the price of feed at the mercantile. Samuel answered as best he could, his voice growing less rusty with each response. Through it all, Kimberly stayed nearby, smoothing over rough patches in the conversation with her easy grace. The dogs changed him. He heard someone murmur, "Who'd have thought?" Miss Hart's had a hand in it too. I'd say, came the knowing. Reply, by the time the crowd began to thin, Samuel felt wrung out, but oddly lighter. Pastor Matthew stopped by, laying a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Good to have you back, son. Your father would be proud." Ertz followed Samuel home. Through the gathering dusk, he lit his lamp and built up the fire, aware of how the hymns still echoed in his mind. The dog sprawled by the hearth, content after its afternoon of attention. Samuel's cabin had always seemed a fortress against the world. But tonight, the walls felt less like barriers and more like shelter. He could almost imagine Sarah's approval of the day's events, could almost hear her voice joining with Kimberly's on those familiar hymns. He fixed a simple supper, sharing bits of salt pork with the dog. The evening settled around them, peaceful and warm. Outside his window, lamplight from distant homes dotted the darkness, no longer seeming quite so far away. The morning air bit sharp as a knife, sending Samuel hustling through his usual chores. The dog followed close, its breath making little clouds in the frigid air. Even with the fire banked high, the cabin held winter's chill, and Samuel noticed the dog shivering despite its thick coat. "Need to find you something warmer," he muttered, remembering the trunk of Sarah's things he'd pushed to the back of the cabin years ago. His throat tightened at the thought of opening it, but the dog's comfort pushed him forward. The trunk sat exactly where he'd left it, gathering dust in the shadows. Samuel's hands trembled as he lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and lavender drifted up. Sarah had always tucked dried flowers between the folds of fabric. For a moment, he had to steady himself against the wall, memories washing over him like a flood. The dog pressed against his leg, offering quiet comfort. Samuel scratched behind its ears, grateful for the warm presence. "All right then," he said softly. "Let's see what we can find." He lifted out Sarah's shawls and Sunday dresses, carefully folded and preserved. Beneath them lay the quilts she'd sewn during long winter evenings, telling stories as her needle flashed in the lamplight. Samuel's fingers traced the familiar patterns, remembering how she described each one as he shifted the heaviest quilt. Something solid thumped against the trunk's bottom. Frowning, Samuel reached deeper and pulled out a leather pouch, its surface smooth with age. He didn't recognize it, but Sarah's neat stitching decorated one corner. The dog watched curiously as Samuel settled cross-legged on the floor, the pouch in his lap. Inside, he found several sheets of paper, yellow and brittle with time. His eyes widened as he began to read. The first page bore careful handwriting, Sarah's father's. He realized, alongside marks he recognized as Comanche symbols. Below these were signatures and official stamps dated nearly 30 years past. Samuel's hands shook as he read further. The documents detailed an agreement between Sarah's family and the local Comanche band in exchange for guaranteed access to the creek that ran through the property. The tribe's leader had granted permanent grazing rights to the family and their descendants. The agreement had been witnessed by both tribal elders and territorial officials. Samuel spread the papers carefully on his table, lighting extra lamps as afternoon faded to evening. He read each page multiple times, his mind racing. These weren't just family papers, they were legal documents that could challenge the railroads, claim to his land. Hours passed. A dog dozed by the fire while Samuel pored over every detail. His eyes burned from squinting at the faded ink, but he couldn't stop. Here was hope, unexpected as spring flowers and snow. Morning light was creeping through his windows when Samuel finally slept. Slumped in his chair. The dog's bark woke him sometime later. Kimberly stood on his porch, concern clear on her face. "Samuel, are you all right? You weren't at the mercantile this morning?" He scrubbed a hand over his face, suddenly aware of his rumpled appearance. "Miss Hart, come in. There's something you need to see." Kimberly followed him to the table, her eyes widening at the spread of documents. The dog settled between them as Samuel carefully explained what he'd found. These proved the land was legally transferred, he finished. The railroad can't just take it. Kimberly studied the papers, her expression troubled. "Samuel, you know how some folks in town view anything to do with the Indians? They might dismiss these as tricks, regardless of the official stamps. But the territorial office witnessed it," Samuel protested. "These are proper legal documents." "Believe you," Kimberly said softly. "But you'll need help to fight this. The railroad has powerful lawyers, and the town council seems eager to support them." Samuel paced the small cabin, the dog trailing after him. "Then, what do you suggest?" "Seek counsel," Kimberly said firmly. "There's a lawyer in Preston Falls who's fought similar cases." She hesitated. "There might be others who could help verify these papers. Others, the Comanche healer who lives beyond the creek. He's old enough to remember when these agreements were made. His testimony could be valuable." Samuel stopped pacing, considering. He'd seen the healer occasionally, gathering plants along the creek bank. They'd never spoken, but the old man had always nodded respectfully when their paths crossed. "You really think he'd help?" Kimberly gathered the papers carefully. "These documents show his people's marks, their promise. In my experience teaching their children, they take such promises seriously." Samuel nodded slowly. The afternoon light was fading, shadows stretching across the cabin floor. He took the leather pouch from Kimberly's hands and tied it securely to his belt. It felt like carrying hope itself, fragile but real. As Kimberly prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Samuel, whatever happens, you're not alone in this fight anymore." The warmth in her eyes made his chest tight. He managed a gruff thank you as she descended the porch steps. That evening, Samuel fixed a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The dog curled near the fire, watching as he absently touched the pouch at his hip. The familiar weight of defeat had lifted somewhat, replaced by something that felt almost like purpose. "Maybe the fight's not lost after all," he murmured. The dog's tail thumped against the floor in quiet agreement, and Samuel allowed himself, for the first time in days, to imagine a future where he kept his home. The next morning dawned cold and clear, frost glittering on the fence posts. Samuel stood before his mirror, fumbling with his good shirt buttons. His fingers, more used to rope and reins than Sunday clothes, felt thick and clumsy. The dog watched from its place by the hearth, head tilted in curiosity at its master's unusual attire. "Don't look at me like that," Samuel muttered, finally managing the last button. "Got to look proper for them townfolk." The leather pouch hung heavy at his side, its weight both comfort and burden. The ride into Cedar Gulch took longer than usual. Samuel kept his horse to a steady walk, mindful of the precious papers he carried. The dog trotted alongside occasionally. Ranging ahead to scout the path, as they approached town, Samuel spotted Kimberly waiting near the council hall steps, her blue dress bright against the weathered wood. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she called softly as he dismounted. Her smile steadied, his nerves somewhat. "Are you ready?" Samuel patted the pouch at his hip. Ready as I'll ever be. Miss Hart. Miss Hart. Inside, the council hall hummed with morning conversation. Samuel recognized most of the faces men he'd known for years, but rarely spoken to. They fell silent as he entered, their eyes following his progress to the front of the room. The dog settled quietly by his feet as Samuel took his place before the council table. Mayor Thompson, a round-faced man with graying temples, called the meeting to order. "Mr. Boone," he said, his voice carrying clear across the room, "we understand. You wish to present something regarding the railroad matter?" Samuel's throat felt dry as sand. He glanced at Kimberly, who nodded encouragingly from her seat in the front row. Drawing a deep breath, he lifted the leather pouch from his belt. "Yes, sir, I do." His voice came out stronger than he expected. "I have here legal documents concerning the land rights along Cedar Creek." He carefully spread the papers on the council table, pointing out the signatures and official stamps. "These show a binding agreement between the previous owners, my late wife's family, and the Comanche people. It grants permanent grazing rights in exchange for shared water access." Councilman Peters, a thin man with hard eyes, barely glanced at the documents. "Indian paper," he scoffed. "You expect us to take this seriously?" "These bare territorial office stamps," Samuel insisted, tapping the official marks. "They're witnessed, proper, and legal." "Legal or not," Mayor Thompson interjected, "surely you understand progress can't be held back by old arrangements with savages." The word hit Samuel like a physical blow. He felt Kimberly stiffen beside him, but her presence helped him keep his voice level. "Those savages, as you call them, honored their word. They kept peace with this town when others didn't. They shared the water that let Cedar Gulch survive." That was then, Councilman Peters said dismissively. "This is now. The railroad means jobs, growth, future." Future, Samuel's voice rose slightly. "Have you forgotten last summer's drought, when half the town's wells ran dry?" He looked each council member in the eye. "That creek water kept your children from thirsting. It's the same creek these papers protect." A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Samuel pressed his advantage. "The agreement ensures water rights for everyone, town and ranch alike. You tear that up for railroad money, what happens next drought?" Mayor Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Now see here, Boone. No, you see here." Samuel's scarred hands spread flat on the table. "This isn't about me keeping my cabin. It's about keeping promises to the living and the dead. You want to break faith with both." Silence fell heavy as anvil iron. The dog, sensing tension, pressed closer to Samuel's legs. Finally, Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "We'll need time to consider these documents." He wouldn't meet Samuel's eyes. Council's adjourned for now. The room erupted in worried whispers as people filed out. Samuel carefully gathered his papers, hands trembling slightly as he returned them to the pouch. He felt drained, like after a long day's hard labor. Outside, bright sunlight and children's laughter broke the heavy mood. A group of pupils from Kimberly's school rushed up, surrounding the dog with happy exclamations. The animal's tail wagged as small hands patted its fur, and Samuel felt some of his tension ease watching their innocent joy. "You did well in there," Kimberly said softly, coming to stand beside him. "You spoke truth they needed to hear." Samuel shook his head. "Don't know if it'll make any difference. Peters and his sort, they've already decided what's right and wrong. Perhaps." Kimberly smiled as one of her younger students offered the dog a piece of jerky. "But you reminded them that right and wrong aren't always as simple as they'd like to believe." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Samuel completed his necessary errands, aware of the townspeople's stares and whispers. Some seemed thoughtful, others angry. By late afternoon, he'd had enough and headed home, the dog trotting faithfully beside his horse. To his surprise, Kimberly arrived at his cabin just before supper time, carrying a covered dish. "I thought you might appreciate some company," she said. "And fresh bread." Samuel found himself oddly grateful for her presence as they shared a simple meal. The cabin felt warmer somehow, less lonely. Even the dog seemed to sense the change, curling contentedly near Kimberly's chair instead of its usual spot by the fire. "You know," Kimberly said, breaking a comfortable silence, "watching you stand up to the council today reminded me of something I teach my students." She smiled, soft in the lamplight. "There's an old hymn about justice rolling down like waters, about standing firm when right is on your side." Samuel stirred his coffee, considering her words. "Ain't sure I felt very righteous in there. Mostly scared and mad." "Courage isn't about not being afraid," Kimberly replied. "It's about doing what's right despite the fear." She reached across the table, briefly touching his scarred hand. "You showed real courage today, Samuel Boone." Something warm bloomed in Samuel's chest at her words, something that felt dangerously like hope. But with it came fear, fear of failure, of losing not just his land, but this newfound connection to someone who seemed to understand him. The dog rose and pressed against his leg, as if sensing his troubled thoughts. Samuel absently scratched its ears, watching the firelight dance across his cabin walls. Everything he had, everything he'd built since losing Sarah, balanced now on those fragile papers and the town's sense of justice. "What happens next?" he asked quietly, not really expecting an answer. Kimberly gathered their empty plates, her movements careful and deliberate. "We wait," she said simply. "We pray. And we remember we're not alone in this fight." The evening settled around them like a soft blanket, filled with unspoken words and possibilities neither dared to name. Outside, an owl called across the darkening valley, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. The winter sun hung pale in a cloudless sky as Samuel worked his fence line. His breath fogged in the crisp morning air while he hammered loose posts back into frozen ground. The dog trotted ahead, sniffing along the wooden rails, tail wagging as it investigated interesting scents. "Stay close now," Samuel called, more from habit than necessity. The animal had proven faithful these past months, never straying far from his side. He'd just finished securing a wobbly post when he heard an odd sound, a wet, choking cough. Samuel turned to see the dog stumbling, its legs giving way beneath. The animal collapsed in the snow, body rigid, white foam gathering at its jaws. No, no, no. Samuel dropped his tools and ran, heart thundering in his chest. The dog's eyes rolled wildly as its body convulsed, nearby, half buried in snow. Samuel spotted scraps of meat scattered along the fence line. His stomach lurched as he recognized the telltale blue-white crystals of strychnine coating the flesh without hesitation. Samuel scooped up the trembling animal. Its weight seemed impossibly light in his arms as he stumbled through the snow toward his cabin. The dog's breath came in ragged gasps against his chest. "Hold on," he whispered hoarsely. "Just hold on." Inside the cabin, Samuel laid the dog gently by the hearth. Its body twisted with another violent spasm, and Samuel's hands shook as he tried to comfort it. He'd seen animals poisoned before, knew how quickly the toxin could kill. "Oh, Lord, help me," he muttered, the words feeling strange on his tongue after so many silent years. "Please." Samuel burst back out into the cold, running for his horse. He needed help, needed someone who knew more than he did about healing. The schoolhouse was closest. He rode hard through town, paying no mind to the startled looks from townspeople. As he thundered past, Kimberly stood at her classroom door, dismissing students for lunch. Her smile vanished when she saw Samuel's face. "The dog," he managed to say, voice raw. Poisoned, please. Understanding flashed in her eyes. She turned to her oldest student, speaking quickly. Mary, watch the younger ones. I'll send word if I'm delayed. The ride back to Samuel's cabin seemed endless, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. They found the dog where he'd left it, still breathing but barely conscious now. Kimberly knelt beside the animal, her hands gentle as she checked its condition. Strychnine, Samuel said, showing her one of the tainted meat scraps he'd gathered. Found it by the fence line. Kimberly's face hardened. This was deliberate. The railroad men... Samuel nodded grimly. Reckon so. Trying to send a message. Need help, Kimberly said, rising decisively. There's a Comanche healer who lives north of town. He knows more about treating poison than anyone else around here. The council won't like that, Samuel warned. The council isn't here. Kimberly's voice was firm. And they're not the ones watching an innocent creature suffer. She rode out immediately, while Samuel stayed with the dog. The animal's breathing grew more labored with each passing hour. Samuel sat beside it, one hand resting on its heaving side, speaking words he hadn't voiced in years. Please, Lord, he whispered, don't take this one too. I've lost enough already. The sun was low when Kimberly returned with the Comanche healer, an elderly man with deep-set eyes and silver hair. He carried a leather bag of supplies and moved. With careful dignity, despite the urgency of the situation. The healer examined the dog thoroughly, speaking in low tones as he worked. The poison is strong, but the animal fights hard to live. He began removing items from his bag, dried herbs, roots, small bottles. Like someone else I see here, he added, glancing meaningfully at Samuel Dot, working with practiced efficiency. The healer brewed a strong-smelling tea over Samuel's fire. This will help fight the poison, he explained, carefully spooning the liquid into the dog's mouth. But the spirit must choose to stay. Through the long night hours, they maintained their vigil. The healer dozed in Samuel's chair while Kimberly and Samuel sat by the hearth, watching every shallow breath the dog took. Sometimes the animal would seize again, and Samuel would hold it until the spasms passed, his own body shaking. Why did they hate me so much? He asked softly when the night was deepest. To hurt an innocent animal just to drive me away. Kimberly's hand found his in the darkness. Fear makes people cruel sometimes. Fear of change, fear of the past, fear of those who stand up against them. I'm afraid too, Samuel admitted. Afraid of losing everything again. You're not alone anymore, Kimberly squeezed his hand. Remember that? As the night wore on, Samuel found himself praying more than he had since Sarah died. Not the formal prayers of his childhood church, but rough, honest words spoken straight from his heart to God. He bargained, pleaded, and finally just asked for mercy. Not for himself, but for the loyal creature that had brought light back into his life. The healer woke periodically to administer more of his medicine. Each time, the dog swallowed a little easier, though its breathing remained shallow and rapid. Outside, an owl called, and the wind whispered through pine branches. Finally, false dawn began to lighten the cabin's windows. Samuel, exhausted, had dozed off with his head against the hearthstones. He woke to something warm and wet touching his hand, the dog's tongue. Weakly licking his fingers, Samuel's vision blurred as he saw the animal's tail faintly wagging, its eyes clearer now and fixed on his face. The terrible rigidity had left its body, replaced by natural sleep-like weakness. Thank you, he whispered, his voice breaking. Thank you, Lord. His shoulders shook with silent sobs of relief as he buried his face in the dog's fur. Kimberly's hand rested warm on his back, and he reached up to grip it tightly. Maybe the Lord hasn't forgotten me after all, he managed to say. The healer nodded approvingly as he gathered his supplies. The animal will need rest and care, but it chooses to stay. A good sign for many things, I think. Samuel walked the old man to his horse, pressing payment into his weathered hands. I'm much obliged to you, more than I can say. We are all connected. The healer replied simply. When we honor those connections, we honor the Creator. He mounted his horse with surprising grace. Remember that when you face what is coming. As the sun rose fully over the mountain, Samuel and Kimberly sat together on his porch steps, watching the dog sleep peacefully just inside the door. The morning light painted the snow in shades of rose and gold, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. The weak winter sun filtered through Samuel's cabin windows as the dog slept fitfully on its blanket by the hearth. 3 days had passed since the poisoning, and though the animal lived, its recovery proved slow. Samuel divided his time between necessary ranch work and tending to his faithful companion, measuring each hour by the steady rise and fall of the dog's chest. Kimberly visited morning and evening, bringing broth and fresh bread. She'd move quietly around the cabin, straightening things Samuel hadn't thought to notice needed straightening. Her presence made the small space feel more like a home than it had in years. The Comanche healer came daily as well, carrying his leather medicine bag and bundles of dried herbs that filled the cabin with sharp, green scents. He would kneel beside the dog, checking its eyes and breathing, before brewing more of his healing tea. On the 4th afternoon, as Samuel helped the elder prepare another batch of medicine, he found himself studying the old man's weathered face. "Sir," he began hesitantly, "I've been meaning to ask about those papers, the agreement about the creek." The healer's hands stilled over his work. He was silent for a long moment, then spoke softly. "Your wife's people made a promise with mine. Water shared meant life shared." He gestured toward the creek, visible through the cabin window. The agreement was simple, grazing rights in exchange for access to the water. Both sides needed each other to survive. Samuel's throat tightened. "But the town stopped honoring that years ago, didn't they?" "Yes." The elder's voice held no bitterness, only a deep weariness. After the war, new settlers came. They did not understand the old ways, the importance of keeping one's word. He added more herbs to the pot. "Many of my people moved north then, but some stayed, remembering the promise." The dog whimpered in its sleep, and Samuel moved to stroke its head. "I should have spoken up sooner," he said roughly. "After Sarah died, I just withdrew from everything. Let things happen that shouldn't have." The healer nodded slowly. "Grief can blind us to many things. But you see clearly now." "Yes, starting to," Samuel admitted. He watched as the elder strained the medicine into a cup. "Those councilmen, they won't want to hear about old promises." "No," the healer agreed, carefully helping Samuel lift the dog's head to drink. "But truth does not change because some refuse to hear it." He packed away his supplies with deliberate care. "Your wife understood this. She spoke often of teaching her children to honor the old agreements." Samuel's hands trembled slightly. Sarah had been carrying their first child when the fever took them both. He'd never known she'd thought that far ahead. Planned for a future he couldn't bear to imagine anymore. That evening, after the healer left, Kimberly arrived with fresh cornbread and stew. She found Samuel sitting silent by the fire, lost in thought. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the floorboards at her entrance. "Penny for your thoughts," she asked softly. Setting down her basket, Samuel looked up, his face troubled in the firelight. "Been thinking about promises," he said, "and how easy it is to let them slip away when you're hurting too much to fight for them." Kimberly pulled up a chair beside him. "Tell me," she said simply. The words came slowly at first, then faster as Samuel described his conversation with the healer. He spoke of Sarah's hopes, the broken treaties, his own years of silence. "I failed them all," he finished roughly. "My wife, her family's promises, even God's call to stand for what's right." Samuel Boone. Kimberly's voice was firm but gentle. "You haven't failed anyone. You're standing up now, aren't you? When it matters most. But is it enough? After all this time, it's never too late to do what's right." Kimberly touched his arm lightly. "The Lord doesn't ask us to be perfect, just faithful. And I see more faith in you every day." Samuel glanced at her, surprised. "How do you figure that?" "The way you tend to this dog, even after what they did to it. The way you're willing to fight for this land, not just for yourself, but for promises made long ago." She smiled. "That takes faith in justice, in mercy, in something bigger than yourself." The dog shifted, laying its head on Samuel's boot. He reached down to scratch behind its ears, considering her words. "There's something else," Kimberly said after a moment. She reached into her shawl and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "I noticed Sarah's Bible on the shelf earlier. When was the last time you opened it?" Samuel's chest tightened. "Not since the funeral," he admitted. "Maybe it's time." She held out the Bible. "Sometimes the words we need most are waiting for us to find them again." Samuel took the book carefully, its familiar weight stirring memories of quiet evenings with Sarah, reading together by lamplight. He opened it slowly, dust falling from between the pages. "Would you read some?" Kimberly asked softly. "I always find it helps to hear the words spoken aloud." Samuel hesitated, then cleared his throat. His voice was rough at first as he began reading from Psalms, but it steadied as he continued. The dog dozed at his feet while Kimberly listened, her face peaceful in the FIRELIGHT. Each evening after that, Samuel would read from Sarah's Bible before bed. Sometimes Kimberly would be there to listen, sometimes just the dog. He found himself lingering over passages about justice, about keeping faith in dark times. The words seemed to speak directly to his situation, giving him strength he hadn't known he needed. One night, reading about David standing before Goliath, Samuel paused. The dog lifted its head, almost recovered now, and regarded him steadily. "Reckon we've got our own giant to face, don't we?" Samuel murmured, scratching the animal's ears. "But at least we won't face it alone." He thought of the healer's quiet dignity, Kimberly's unwavering support, and the dog's loyal presence. The railroad men might have money and influence on their side, but Samuel had something else, truth, and people willing to stand beside him to defend it. Setting the Bible aside, Samuel knelt to check the dog's healing wounds one last time before bed. The animal's tail wagged steadily now, its eyes bright and alert. In the lamplight, Samuel could see new strength returning to its body day by day. We're both healing, he realized aloud, inside and out. The dog pressed its head against his hand, and Samuel felt the familiar surge of gratitude, not just for the animal's recovery, but for all the changes its arrival had set in motion. Through caring for this creature, he'd found his way back to community, to faith, and to fighting for what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in the battle for his land, but tonight, in the quiet of his cabin, with Sarah's Bible nearby, and the dog warm against his leg, Samuel felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it with clear eyes and a steady heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Gulch's dusty main street as Samuel guided his wagon toward the town hall. Beside him, Kimberly sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, while the Comanche healer rode his own horse alongside them. The old leather pouch containing the deed hung heavy at Samuel's belt. Inside the hall, townsfolk packed the wooden benches, their whispers rising like wind. Through prairie grass, Mr. Caldwell stood at the front, his Eastern suit pristine despite the frontier dust. Railroad maps and contracts spread across the council table, their crisp pages catching the light from the windows. "Progress waits for no man," Caldwell was saying, his voice smooth as creek stones. "The railroad brings gold to every town it touches. Jobs for your sons, markets for your goods." He gestured to the contracts. $10,000 just to start, gentlemen." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Samuel felt their hunger for prosperity, sharp as winter wind. He rose slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. "Money ain't everything," Samuel said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner. "Some things are worth more than gold." He withdrew the deed from its pouch, holding it carefully, like promises made in good faith. The healer stepped forward, his dignity commanding. "Attention. My people and his wife's family made a covenant," he explained, indicating the marks on the deed. "Water shared between us, grazing rights respected. A promise as old as the creek itself." Caldwell's laugh cut through the air. "Superstitious? Nonsense. You expect modern commerce to bow to primitive agreements?" Several men chuckled, but others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Those primitive agreements," Samuel's voice hardened, "kept peace in this valley when peace was hard to find. They're worth honoring. The law recognizes proper contracts." Caldwell sneered, tapping his papers. "Not Indian marks on old leather." Angry voices rose from both sides. Someone shouted about progress, another about broken treaties. The tension stretched tight as fiddle strings about to snap. Then came the soft click of claws on wood. The dog appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but steadily. Its fur still showed the marks of its poisoning, but its head was high, its eyes bright. Children called out in delight, several rushing to greet it. The clamor died away as the dog made its way down the center aisle. It stopped beside Samuel, leaning slightly against his leg. Every eye in the hall fixed on the animal, its scars visible proof of the railroad men's cruelty. Its presence a testament to survival. Samuel rested his hand on the dog's head. "Look here," he said, into the silence. "This creature nearly died. From poison meant to drive me off my land. But it found the strength to stand again." His gaze swept the room. "If this dog can rise again, so can honor in this town." Kimberly stood beside him, her voice clear and strong. "We all saw what was done to this innocent animal. Will we let the same happen to our neighbors, to promises that kept peace?" The healer nodded slowly. "The dog teaches us. When we heal one wound, we begin to heal all wounds." Through the windows, morning light spilled across the council table, illuminating both the railroad's contracts and the old deed with its careful marks. The town stood at a crossroads, with gold gleaming down one path and honor down the other. Samuel waited, the dog warm against his leg, while the council members exchanged long looks. The future of Cedar Gulch hung in the balance, measured not in dollars, but in the weight of promises kept or broken. The council chambers emptied slowly as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Mayor Thompson's gravelly voice echoed through the hall. "We'll need time to consider both claims. The council will announce its decision next week." Samuel stood on the wooden sidewalk, watching townsfolk scatter like leaves in autumn wind. Some nodded to him now, their earlier certainty shaken. The dog pressed close to his leg, its warmth steady in the cooling evening air. Kimberly emerged last, clutching her shawl against the chill. "May I walk with you?" she asked softly. They fell into step together, the dog padding alongside them. Cedar Gulch settled into evening quiet, lamps being lit in windows, dinner smoke rising from chimneys, stars beginning to peek through purple clouds. Their boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk, then crunched on gravel as they turned toward the schoolhouse where Kimberly lived. "I'm scared for you, Samuel," Kimberly finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they choose the railroad's offer," she trailed off, Unable to finish, Samuel glanced at her profile in the deepening dusk. "I was scared too, at first," he admitted. "Thought losing my land would be like losing my last tie to Sarah, to everything. We built together." He paused, gathering his thoughts. But something's changed. They stopped beneath a giant cottonwood, its bare branches stark against the darkening sky. Kimberly turned to face him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "What changed?" "Found. Out there's worse things than losing land," Samuel said. "Living without honor, that's a kind of death that comes before the dying." He looked down at the dog, remembering its fight to survive the poison. "When they tried to kill this creature just to drive me off, I realized what really mattered. Wasn't keeping my property. It was standing up for what's right." Kimberly's hand found his, her fingers warm despite the evening chill. "Your wife would be proud of you, Samuel. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing you this dog, helping. You find those papers showing you your own strength again." Samuel's throat tightened at her words. Their hands remained clasped, neither wanting to let go. The dog sat patient beside them, its tail sweeping gentle arcs in the dust. "Thank you," Samuel managed, "for helping me see clear again, for standing beside me today." "The Lord hasn't forgotten you, Samuel," Kimberly whispered. "And neither have I." They parted reluctantly, Kimberly climbing the steps to her door while Samuel and the dog watched until she was safely inside. The walk home to his cabin was quiet, filled with starlight and the sound of night birds. Inside, Samuel lit his lamp and stoked the fire. Instead of settling into his chair as usual, he found himself drawn to his bedside. Slowly, feeling awkward but certain, he knelt beside the bed. The dog padded over, lying down next to him with a contented sigh. "Lord," Samuel whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I ain't asked for much these past years, been too angry, too lost. But tonight I'm asking not for victory, not for my land. Just for the courage to do what's right, no matter what comes." He paused, swallowing hard. "And thank you for sending me guides to light the way back to you." The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor, like a gentle amen. Samuel remained kneeling, peace settling over him like a familiar blanket, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, he'd face it with his faith restored and his heart true. The church pews creaked under the weight of the entire town. Late afternoon. Sun streamed through dusty windows, casting long shadows across worn floorboards. Samuel stood at the front, his dog lying quietly beside him, while Kimberly and the Comanche healer flanked him like steadfast guardians. Samuel's voice, usually so gruff, carried clear and strong through the hushed room. "This ain't just about a piece of paper," he said, holding up the deed. "It's about a promise made in good faith. My wife's family and the Comanche people shared that water in peace. Now we're ready to throw away that covenant for railroad gold." Kimberly stepped forward, her teacher's voice firm and certain. "As Christians, we're taught that our word is sacred. How can we teach our children about honor if we break promises for profit?" The council members huddled at their table, heads bent close, whispers sharp. Mayor Thompson's hand trembled as he counted the votes. "By 5 votes to 4, he announced, the council recognizes Samuel Boone's deed and rejects the railroad's claim. A wave of reaction swept through the church. Some folks jumped up cheering, while others stormed out, boots heavy on the wooden steps. Samuel stood still, decades of tension draining from his shoulders. Beside him, Kimberly's hand found his, fingers intertwining right there in front of God and everyone. The little church of Cedar Gulch glowed with morning sunlight as folks gathered for worship. Samuel paused at the doorway, drawing strength from Kimberly's presence beside him and the faithful dog at his other side. His heart lifted as faces turned toward him, not with the old fear and suspicion, but with welcoming nods and gentle smiles, the organ creaked to life and hymn books rustled open. Samuel found himself joining the familiar melody of Amazing Grace, his deep voice blending with Kimberly's clear tones. The dog lay contentedly at his feet, while the congregation's voices rose to the rough-hewn rafters. After the service, children spilled onto the church steps, gathering around the shepherd dog with gentle hands and excited whispers. Kimberly's laughter rang out as she watched them take turns patting its shaggy head and offering treats. As winter's early dusk settled over Cedar Gulch, Samuel lifted his brass lantern to light their way home. The three of them walked together, Samuel, Kimberly, and the dog, their shadows stretching long across the snow-dusted path. Later that night, Samuel sat at his cabin table, now warm with lamplight and companionship. He bowed his head, offering heartfelt thanks for the blessings of faith restored and loneliness banished. The old cabin, once his fortress of solitude, had transformed into a true home, filled with the quiet joy of belonging. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.